Now, folks, it's November 5th, and we still don't have a clear answer on who won the 2020 presidential elections. And now talk is coming in about the deep state. Talk is coming in about possible fraud when it comes to Trump talking about it. There are ongoing scandals, many issues in the U.S. And now going back to 2017, one of the first people to warn about, they say, divide ideologically within the U.S. government and the intelligence community was Rich Higgins. He wrote a memo that was internal, not meant to be public, warning about what he called the deep state, warning also about what he said was a conspiracy among socialist-minded people who are planning to really kind of alter the way things are being done within the U.S. government. He's now written a book called The Memo, talking about his 20 years and what he calls the deep state. So we invited him now to speak with us about his book and about what's happening now in the country. Rich Higgins, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me.
So I guess just briefly, let's go over what happened, because you were with the National Security Council, you wrote this memo, you were fired for it. What exactly happened at that time?
Well, as the book implies, some of us had been inside the system for a number of years, fighting for what I always called a reality-based foreign policy, a reality-based intelligence assessment. And what I was concerned about during my time in those early months of the Trump administration was, the president and most of the president's entourage and the people around him were not, traditional political people. They weren't familiar with the ways of Washington. And I was concerned by what was clear to me, an operation being run, against the president on, this is, before Lisa Page or Peter Strzok or any of those people were household names. It was easily discernible to people who'd worked inside the black operations world that what was happening to the president was an operation of some sort. And what I wanted to kind of lay down a marker was, we know there's an operation underway. They're seeking to delegitimize you, potentially remove you. Here are some of the people who might be interested in making that happen. And here's the way that they deploy narratives, the Russia narrative, for example, where Russia hacked the election narrative. The Russia narrative is an example of what they're doing. And then you lay that out with, the traditional sort of political warfare tactics that we saw being deployed. And the memo was for internal consumption, thinking, okay, maybe this will help the president understand what's happening to him in a more full context than, I was concerned that he was seeing it as sort of normal DC smash mouth politics, but it was more than that.
Well, this is interesting because we talk about political warfare. One of my big focuses is China. They have a political warfare department, the General Political Department Liaison Department. We know also there's just normal political strategy. Everybody does it if you're in politics. How does political warfare differ from normal political strategy? Because he said when Trump came in, maybe he just thought it was normal politics. He didn't anticipate that maybe it was the individuals in the intelligence community, as we're now seeing, who may have been involved in this. How would you define the difference between political warfare and normal political strategy?
When I use the term political warfare, I mean it in the Maoist sense of the term. And I think the thing that Americans struggle with is when we hear the term war, we've watered down the meaning of the term through words like drug war and other stuff like that. But to a Chinese strategist, war is part of a continuum. It's part of the same continuum that politics relies on. And when Mao talked about the term political warfare, what he would talk about, and it's the difference between, I think, political strategy, which is a binary, contestable, decisive engagement, versus political warfare, which is a perpetual movement, a constant effort to drive people towards what Mao calls the mass line or the mass base, the ever-increasing growth of his cadres, the ever-increasing growth of his political power through the growth of those cadres. We see those tactics now, the growth of the left inside the United States, to include the consumption of, what in the past would have been citadels of the West, citadels of Western civilization, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Department of Justice. These are places where you would never have dreamed of seeing communist sympathizers in the past. And today we see them right out in in the open. And so when I was writing the memo back at that time, I didn't want to get into doing a PhD dissertation on Maoism, obviously, right? And we could talk about that some other time. But the current situation, to include our domestic political situation, is completely informed by by the Chinese strategic situation vis-a-vis the United States. Insofar as, if you look at the One Belt, One Road strategy, which is nothing less than the unification of the Eurasian landmass under an economic empire controlled by China, they have a lot of allies here inside the United States, on Wall Street, in our corporations, and certainly, and we've seen it in the past couple of days, in our media. And it's really frightening, the situation we find ourselves in. So there are enormous geopolitical consequences to the election of President Trump, to the MAGA movement itself, and then you see them now trying to arrest the MAGA movement at this electoral pass. And the Republican red wave has really crashed upon the side of their ship, and they're listing badly, and they're pulling out all the stops to try and stop President Trump and the MAGA movement.
Now, from the surface, from the standpoint of a lot of average Americans, I know a lot of conservatives especially believe there's some type of collusion between politics, between the intelligence community, between the media, and even between some big businesses like big tech. Do you think this is an accurate perception, or is this just people kind of having the same different worldviews or perceptions and they're just doing it grassroots? Do you think there's direct coordination, or is this just a worldview type thing?
It isn't one or the other, right? I mean, I think there are some situations where, you're a fellow traveler, you're a cadre, you sort of believe in the same socialist program or whatnot. But you also see there's a deliberate decision made to have in a united front, if you will, to use the Maoist term, against the shared enemy, right? I mean, how is it that the Muslim Brotherhood is working with these secular, Democrat Socialists of America communist groups? How does that happen? Well, both of them see the MAGA movement in a risen American, traditional America, Judeo-Christian values, et cetera, as a threat to them. And we see, again, going back to the internationalization of the domestic political situation, where do we see right now? We see this unstated alliance between Erdogan and Turkey with Xi, right? I mean, why is Erdogan so silent on the treatment of the Uyghurs? Because he's got massive economic stake in the Yobor project, because Turkey's historical role and the Ottomans' historical role in the Silk Road, in the Bosphorus Strait, obviously.
Now, when it comes to the current elections, I think depending which side of the aisle you're on, you're interpreting it very differently. Democrats, based on the way they're seeing it, they think for the most part Trump is trying to basically stop votes from being counted. A lot of conservatives, they see that it appears that local governments used the COVID-19 lockdowns, the CCP virus lockdowns, to create new laws that alter the way elections are run, possibly going against federal law. And that was used to basically make it so that votes could be counted that would not normally be counted. And had they been finalized on November 3rd, on that night, very likely Trump may have won by now. And so Trump is now trying to fight back against this. When it comes to the situation at hand of what's taking place with the elections and being dragged out for this long, does this look like a political warfare operation to you, or is this just the craziness of 2020 manifesting yet again?
I think I don't have hard evidence yet. All right, so I'm going to put that caution on the table. I think there's enough to merit a serious investigation. And I'm seeing what you're seeing: the Twitter anomalies, the votes showing up in the middle of the night, the counts that go on forever. Let's stop all 6 states where it looks like Trump may be searching. And I mean, there's a lot of evidence there that requires further investigation. So without saying definitively, I'm definitely putting my my hand up for, this needs to be looked at. I think we have constitutional measures in place, though, so we need a legal framework to engage with the state legislatures who will seat the electors. If there is malfeasance found in the voting process, those state legislatures can act. They're going to need evidence to do so, right? So there are political, legal solutions. I'd like to see a more succinct and coherent messaging approach to this from the Trump administration presently, and I'd like them to engage specifically the disinformation campaign that we've seen now going on for a year and a half from the media as it pertains to the election. Of all the things that I think I'm most shocked about that I've seen in the past couple of days is the incessant media tipping of the scale through the provision of narrative on one hand, and then the selective distribution of information on the other hand, right? They're not only lying to you, they're also withholding information from you. It really is disgusting.
Yeah, withholding information and then censoring you if you step out of line with it, which is why, a lot of independent media get deplatformed and censored as well.
Right.
Now, when it comes to the deep state, back when you wrote this memo, 2017, even 2016, people were kind of talking about it, but if you talked about it, you were called a conspiracy theorist. And then ironically, the term kind of did become normal. Some big mainstream media wrote articles saying, yes, there's a deep state and they're here to protect us. They switched the whole narrative around. It exists, but they saw it as interestingly, a good thing, some of them. Now, when we talk about a deep state, there's a few different ways some of us think about it. We might think the seventh floor group when it comes to some of these different government branches, like the Justice Department seventh floor group, being kind of like the managers of the FBI and so on. We hear older references to the mandarins, to the bow ties, to the black dragons, these people who kind of can call the shots when it comes to international relations, war, so on, from more of a political standpoint and stopping things getting done that guys on the ground may not always like being stopped. When you talk about the deep state, is it these folks? Is it these groups, or is it something else?
Well, at the time I wrote the memo, I think I was referring specifically to the unelected bureaucracy, right? And the unelected bureaucracy that serves itself, right? I think a simple way to explain it is Bob Comer, who ran the CORDS program in Vietnam, the Civilian Occupation Rural Development Program in Vietnam, came back from Vietnam having fought these bureaucracies at State Department and Defense Department. He wrote a book, and he called the book Bureaucracy Does Its Thing. And I think that's the way I describe the deep state. The deep state to me is the bureaucracy unencumbered by any sort of fealty to, a we the people, the American people. That said, I don't attribute that behavior to everybody inside the bureaucracy. I think and part of the reason I wrote this book is there are a lot of patriots inside the bureaucracy, thousands and thousands of them. And they're as frustrated, I think, as the American people are, perhaps more so, by what they see from the seventh floor leadership culture that's been created, which is, it's infested with this sort of leftist, politically correct, and the politically correct thinking informs all of their decision making. And in that environment, what happens is outside influences take root, right? And those outside influences take root because you have this small coterie of people who've passed the test to be able to become a leader because they've adhered to these politically correct narratives. Quick example for your audience. I had a Navy SEAL friend of mine at the National War College. This guy had been in literally 12 combat deployments over the past 20 years. When he goes to the National War College, you think he's going to write a paper on counterterrorism or intelligence or something like that. No, he writes his paper on climate change because he knows if he doesn't write it on climate change, he'll never make it from captain to admiral. That's the type of culture that you're fighting against.
Very interesting. Now, you spent 20 years in this. Now, this is important for people because you're not like a Trump guy. You were in long before Trump. You were there with Bush, very likely. You were there with Obama, very likely. And then you were there with Trump. And you observed something different with Trump that made you concerned enough that you did write this memo that got you fired. And what was it? You were there for 20 years. What changed in terms of what you were seeing that made you do that?
Well, I think maybe I was naive, right? The Mr. Smith goes to Washington type thing, right? I mean, but I became concerned because during the Bush years, I saw an attempt to suspend reality and to push narratives down into the decision-making cycle to the point where they were impacting operations on the ground, frankly, getting people killed, right? Their unwillingness to speak reality about the truth on the ground. That problem only became 10 times worse under the Obama administration, where to even raise your hand and question, a point of view was to find yourself on the out, pursued, investigated, throttled. And so, having experienced that for, going on the better part of 15 years, when President Trump announced his candidacy, I was skeptical at first, like many. And I had the opportunity to meet him, and you'll learn about this if you read the book. I had the opportunity to meet him in December of 2015, and frankly, he surprised me. He was very knowledgeable on some things I didn't expect him to be knowledgeable on, particularly as it related to the Middle East and terrorism. And he asked a lot of smart questions, and he's surprisingly funny and surprisingly intelligent. People don't give him enough credit for his humor or his intelligence. But I studied engineering undergraduate, and he reminded me a lot of the engineers I studied with, to be candid with you. Not exactly articulate in the way that you expect some people to be. And but the wheels were always turning. He was always thinking. He was thinking very quickly. He reminded me of the guys I grew up with in Boston. He was from New York, so the talking fast and the moving hands didn't bother me.
Interesting. Now, you were 20 years in what you call the deep state, this entrenched bureaucracy, and you're describing a culture there that is more far left aligned, socialist aligned, that does seem to have really altered the way that things can be done. And if you step out of line of that, you risk being attacked, purged, whatever. When it comes to how this, these bureaucrats, I guess we could call them, these entrenched bureaucrats, view normal incoming presidents or normal incoming administrations, how is it typically viewed? Do you view it as a party coming in? Do you view it as an individual coming in? Do you view it as something temporary, gone in 8 years, only so much they can do? How is it viewed?
Well, I think that I can speak as to my time inside the system. We always look forward to the transition period, even if it was internal to the administration, because we knew we'd have a little bit of more latitude left and right to get stuff done, right? I mean, there's a certain element of truth in that, right? There are folks who are inside these jobs that they're doing them day in and day out, and they realize that perhaps whatever it be, an acquisition, a policy decision they want made, some sort of a shift they want done on a program or project that for whatever reason an administration is blocking it or inhibiting it for some reason, you can get some stuff done there. So I think there's oversight in general is resented, right? And it's not, I don't mean to sound like it's scorned. It's not like that. It's just they know when to make their moves. And I never saw outright hostility towards an administration, from inside the deep state, looking up at the political leadership. But I detected, particularly in the Obama years, towards post 2010, 2011, that hostility down towards the bureaucracy became greater and greater to the point where it was almost unbearable. Where guidance was coming down out of the National Security Council that prohibited the use of certain words. We weren't allowed to use certain terminology. We weren't allowed to discuss specific subjects. There had been some of that in the 2003-2004 window with the Bush administration, but nothing like what I saw in the I guess really post-2010 Obama years.
Now, Rich, again, when it comes to what you saw and why you wrote this memo, you were talking about what later did prove to be true. You were one of the first people to warn about it, that basically the institutions within the intelligence community were being used to launch, what was more essentially like an ideological coup, not a military coup, not a, violent coup, but something ideological meant to really call into question the legitimacy of a presidency, this whole Crossfire hurricane scandal. What did you see in terms of this unfolding, and how was it that based on what you warned about, because again, you were talking about it before really anybody else was, what did you see taking place? What was the level of organization within it? Was this just a few different individuals who had their own opinions and wanted to use their positions to frame this? Or was this something bigger? How would you describe this?
Well, it was definitely something bigger. It was clear to me as early as within the first week after election night that something was wrong. The Clinton campaign had done their, Russia, you're Putin's puppet thing, and that's all to be expected as part of the political process. What was frightening to me was, we were approaching November 20th, say, and that narrative was growing. It was becoming talked about more and more, and it was being pushed. And so I knew something was off. And then, as we saw early on, there were elements of the transition team that just it wasn't making sense. The people who had been with the president during the campaign were now being pushed aside. a lot of establishment people who were, never, not just not supportive, but active, never Trumper Republicans finding their way into the administration. And I agree with Steve Bannon when he said, I think he's on his 60 Minutes interview said, trying to work with the Republican National Committee may have been the original sin of the administration, right? It affected everything else, which was largely true. But even within that, there were some specific individuals that were brought in that were just shocking. And I saw them, blocking MAGA supporters who'd submitted their resumes to the website and so on and so forth. So it was clear to me that there was a quote unquote operation being run. Whether it was political or the intelligence community or whatnot wasn't really clear at that time. Where it became clear that the intelligence community had a direct role in it was after Ezra Cohen discovered the unmasking abuses that were happening. And that was maybe a day or two after General Flynn had been removed and resigned. And that was when it was clear, okay, now we're starting to see why things are going the way they're going. And it took, probably 2 months of, engagement with the House Intel Committee lawyers, then with Devin Nunes and with the National Security Council legal staff, and just to start getting our arms around, okay, what are we actually even looking at here? Because the scale of it was so large. I mean, it wasn't 2 or 3 rogue agents. I mean, these were agency-wide, interagency-wide efforts that have been undertaken. And I'm not even convinced that today, after a year and a half of investigation by Durham, that they fully comprehend everything that took place under it because it was so large.
Now, Rich, you just released your book, The Memo. Just, I guess, as a last question, given it's an interesting timing for it to come out. I don't think anybody anticipated what's happening now with the elections. If you were to kind of leave people with one message, there's one thing they get from your book and from your story, what do you hope they take home from this?
Well, I wrote the book for 2 reasons. One is I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I wanted to reclaim sort of my footing in that sense, career-wise. The second reason I wrote it is to show how somebody inside the system with a specific series of experiences that were, they were unique. I had some really unique vantage points over the past 20 years, could come to be a red-pilled MAGA patriot, right? And that you just have to look at the problem holistically to understand all these forces that are in play, and you'll come to the same conclusion too. And I wrote the book in a way that hopefully, through my experience, you can share that experience. I mean, it's not, I write a lot of very technical things. People who've read stuff I've written in the past will say, oh, I can't read that guy's stuff. It's too technical. This is written in a way that you can gobble this in a 3-hour airplane ride.
Great. Hey, Rich, a real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you. Now, that said, folks, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, I do a live Q&A on Sundays, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so tune in for that. And folks, we're in uncertain times right now. But one of the greatest cures to uncertainty is good old-fashioned accurate news reporting. At the Epoch Times, we're trying to restore integrity to journalism under the principles of truth and tradition. If you want to support Crossroads, the best way to do so is to subscribe to the Epoch Times. I'll have a link to that in the description below if you're interested. Again, we'd really appreciate your support. Now, that said, folks, as always, stay informed and stay free.